Hello, good morning and welcome everybody. This is Richard Keeves and welcome to this concise webinar, The Secret Ingredient of a Successful Brand. I would also like to welcome our guest presenter for today, Michelle Hogan. G'day, Michelle.
Hey, Richard. Good to be here.
Thank you very much for being here. And of course, Gareth Lane. Gareth.
Gareth Voice reporting for duty as usual.
As usual, well done. Thank you to everyone for participating in this webinar today. As for those people who haven't been to one of our concise webinars, these are 100% educational. That's the intention. No waffle, no sales pitches, expert advice you can use. That's what it's all about, and tips for helping grow your business. And that is the focus. So before we begin, housekeeping, we are recording the session. You are welcome to ask questions as we go along, and we'll also have live Q&A at the end. Now I'm going to hand over to Michelle, who is going to be running today's presentation. Take it away, Michelle.
Thanks, Richard. So hello, everybody. It's really good to be here. This is going to be a romp, and we're going to go through a lot of information in a pretty short and fast pace. So if there's ideas and concepts that you want to dig into a bit more, there's plenty of articles out there that I've written that will help you do that. And also everyone who attends today's session will get a free copy of my ebook, which goes into more detail about the stuff as well. So really want to give you the tools to be able to use the stuff that we're going to talk about. So as the title said, the secret ingredient of a successful brand. So that's really where we're going to start. So I'm going to flip through the deck, and you'll notice that my slides are pretty straightforward, not lots of text and stuff, because I really wanted this to be more of a conversation. And why isn't my slide, there we go. So the secret ingredient of a successful brand. It hides in plain sight is the interesting thing. It's something we all do, make, keep and break all the time. It's impossible to avoid. Even if we wanted to, we can't. And it's an inherent part of how we trade in what we do every day. So every business, every organization is always trading stuff, right? So we're trading this for that, internally and externally. And the secret ingredient of your brand actually sits within that activity and wraps around it. So what is it? So the secret ingredient of a brand is your promises. Now this might sound like a pretty generalized idea of what a secret ingredient can be, but hopefully by the time we get through the end of this, you'll really understand why it's such a powerful and pretty transformative comment. You might think when you hear of a promise, especially with relationship to brand, you might think about brand promises, right? So agencies and people love to come up with the brand promise. That's not what I'm talking about. It's certainly part of the promise, but the promises that I'm talking about are much more day-to-day. They're implicit, they're explicit, they live in everything that we do. They're in the agreements that we make about what we do, how we do it, and they're really driven by why we do it. Now, these aren't the sorts of promises that this guy makes, right? So when quite often when people make promises, you get the hope and apologize, right? That she'll be right, mate. We're making this kind of promise. We'll figure out how to do it later. The promises that I'm talking about are actually promises that you can keep. So how do you do that, and how do you think about that in a way that gets you to the point of a brand that people want to stick with? Because again, if we go back, one of the things I use to describe a brand is the secret ingredient lives in my definition and description. Brand is the result of the promises you keep. Now, I remember one of the early conversations I had with Richard actually about this topic, and he made the point, well, isn't it more about they're the promises that you've got to make promises you can keep? It's not just the ones you keep. So doesn't that mean that your brand's also the result of the promises you don't keep? And actually, yeah, that's true, because the promise you don't keep is the promise that you make, right? So if I make a promise and I don't keep it, what I did becomes what people get. So if my brand is a result of all of that, I better make sure that I'm doing and saying stuff that I can do. That's why it's such an important and powerful concept. You don't want this to be happenstance. You don't want it to be something that you're winging, and that you're not really making with a lot of intention. So a promise is fundamentally how you communicate what you intend. So if you think about that for a minute, right? So we want to do this as a business. We want people to use this product, have this service, be a member, whatever the nature of your organization is. So how do you communicate what you intend about that to people so that they engage, so that they buy from you, so that they join, become part of what you're doing? Because when I'm talking about promises you can keep, I'm not just talking about customer promises. I'm actually talking about the promises that you make to every human that you deal with, right? To everyone, internal and external. So customers, employees, partners, investors, other stakeholders. They might be government, it might be industry groups, it might be, the list is almost endless. Suppliers, vendors, and on it goes. All of these promises matter. And they are all basically a communication of what you intend within that relationship. And so in order to do that well, you've got to do it with some discipline. Discipline's a really misunderstood thing in business. A lot of people mistake it for a sense of rigidity, right? This is what we're going to do the same way every single time. I think of discipline as more of a habit. It's a way that we do things that we almost just bring to the table, no matter what the situation is. And to get really good at promising, it has to become a discipline that you have. It's no good trying to do this stuff on the fly when something big comes up and you're trying to make the right decision about what you say you will intend. You actually have to bring it back so that it's ingrained. We're always doing it. So I've been doing a lot of research around promises and the relationship they have to the brand result for a couple of years now. And I've assembled a bit of a checklist for some key things that you need to think about in that intending. So we have to think about our risk, right? So what is the risk to us and the risk to the person that we're making the promise to if we don't keep the promise? What is the reward if we do keep the promise on both sides? Because keep in mind, a promise always includes two parties. We'll leave promises to self for another time. But a promise always includes two parties. So it's the promise and the person I'm promising to. This is something you need to think about. What is the risk? What is the reward? Do we have the resources to keep the promise? Right? So there's a really big component here in terms of the skills, the people, the finance, the technology. Like, do we have the resources? Do we have time to keep the promise? So if we don't have some of those resources in place, if the promises are way away, then we might have time to do it. If we don't, and we make a promise, then we've kind of screwed ourselves before we begin. And again, every time we break a promise, we are effectively eroding the brand result that we want to have. So we have an idea of where we want to be, how we want people to see us, what we want them to think about us, and what we stand for, and the way we do things. In order for that to be true, we've actually got to do it. So every time we do something that erodes that, we are eroding our brand result. Every time we keep a promise we make, we are actually continuing the result. We're allowing it to grow, to get stronger, to get more robust. And there's a reason why that matters that I'll get to in a bit. So a couple of other things on the checklist you might want to think about. Do we have the culture to keep the promise we're making? Are we promising to do something really quickly, but actually we work a bit more like a tortoise? Is the environment that we're making the promise within one that we can count on to help us keep the promise? Right? Are we automatically setting ourselves up for failure because there's some legislative agenda that's going to undermine the promise that we made. These are all things that sort of you can either touch on really quickly, just as almost like a flick through, or spend a lot of time on if it's a really big, important promise. But the key is you've got to do it before you make the promise. That's the discipline. The discipline is doing this ahead of actually saying what you're going to do. Ahead of the agreement, make sure you know what you want to promise. Again, what do I want to communicate about what we intend? Make sure you're clear and really understand what that is. Because then when you do that, and you do it over and over and over again, it builds consistency. And really, if promise has two bedfellow ingredients that are really important to achieving a brand result, discipline and consistency would go along. Because it doesn't matter if I make a promise, if I keep a promise every now and then. If the rest of the time I'm breaking them, it makes no difference. You're still going to be absolutely eroding your brand result to the point where it virtually doesn't exist, right? So if I'm doing it consistently, so what do I need to do to make sure that, again, that I've got the discipline in place so that when I'm making these, when I'm thinking about the agreements that we're making, what we say we're going to do, that I'm doing that in a way that I can be consistent. What are the processes and the practices and the skill sets we need to incorporate and build up internally so that that's true? This is the work, this is the work of brand that people don't talk about. Everybody spends their time talking about the creative endeavor of brand and all the artifacts and the visual stuff. That's just how people pick you out of a lineup. It's not actually what people relate and build relationship with. They build relationship with what you do and how you do it. And absolutely central to that are the promises that you make and keep. Okay, so to help you do this in a way that's kind of that you can be consistent with, come up with this brand formula, and anybody can use this. It's simple for a reason, but not. It's simple to look at, simple to get your head around, but it's incredibly requires a lot of discipline and consistency to do well. So the first piece of it is I, so that's identity. So your identity basically multiplied out through the promises that you make. Those promises are then kept or broken in the experience that you deliver to people, any people, results in your brand. So this is the brand formula. And I'm going to touch on each element of these really quickly. I've just spent a bunch of time talking about the promises piece. So let me now connect it to the identity and the experience piece for you, okay? So identity piece, so the next piece is identity. So identity is your purpose and values. Effectively, it's our intention. It's what do we believe? What's important to us? This is the nature of identity. And I've got really no time for the kumbaya folks, which are that they have to be good and they have to be stuff that everybody likes and feels nice about. I actually am interested only in two things. Is it what you believe, and is it how you do things? Because really that's what identity is. If you think about it, right? If you think about two people and you were to ask somebody, so what do you think of that other person? Right? Their response is going to be based on their experience of that person, what they do and say, and how they show what's important to them. That's identity. Organizations are no different. So when you're thinking about your purpose, what's most important to us? I'm not making a judgment on what that should be, but what's most important? What are we willing to stand behind and put a stake in the ground about? Values, how do we do things around here? Not the stuff on the wall that we'd like to think we do, but actually literally, what are the things that shape how we behave, the decisions that we make, how we act? That's really your values. So understanding those two things is absolutely critical to the brand result. And I would I basically would say you can't make good promises if you don't understand that about yourself. So what is your identity is the first element of the brand formula that's so important. We talked about promises, as I said, so I'm going to jump to the experience piece, because this is where so many people these days are spending a lot of money and a lot of time and getting it way wrong. Again, experience is just where your promises get kept or broken, first and foremost. And it's the experience of everybody that you deal with, not just customers. Because I can tell you from experience, I can say, clients that I've worked with and organizations I've observed, if you're making promises you can't keep, there is absolutely no chance that the people that you're working with are having a good experience. It's just not, that those things don't correlate. So experience is very much around what's happening, what have you said I will do, what's the expectation that you've set, what's the agreement that we've made, and did that follow through? This isn't about wow and delight and going the extra mile and all of that stuff, which is really toxic to organizations, because you're going to run into a point where you can't do more, where you can only do that thing that you've said. So when it comes to experience, I have a really simple formula. It's set expectations and meet them. Right? So you can see how that relates directly back to promises. Make promises you can keep and keep them. If you want people to be satisfied, to be happy and have a good experience, that's it. There's no hidden special sauce to that. And it continues as a loop, right? So the identity, promises, and experience, they work together in alchemy, day in, day out, action and decision at a time, right, across the full scope of unheroic work. And I call it really specifically unheroic work. It's actually the title of the ebook that you'll be getting from me for free. The unheroic work is this day-to-day block and tackle of the business that nobody wants to talk about as being relevant to brand and the result that brand is. But it's all of it. There's no high-profile visual campaign. There's no sexy anything that you can do that will replace the concert of an organization working together on the unheroic work to the same end that they all understand the value of. The person making the phone calls, answering the phone, the person stocking the shelves, the person entering the data, the person on the manufacturing line, the person sitting in the grind, taking the orders and on the e-commerce website, getting the fulfillment taken care of. All of that stuff is the mother's milk of achieving something that people want to stick with. Because words are cheap, you can say whatever you like, but it's what I actually experience that stays with me. And it's nearly always the little stuff that people trip over. Because, I'm never going to work with them again because I don't agree with their strategy, said no one ever. But plenty of people have said, I'm never going to work with them again because they didn't do X that they said they were going to do. So that's where this stuff's really important. So just going back to where I began, right? Brand is a result of the promises you keep. And promises are the secret ingredient. Get that right, and you will have a robust and resilient brand result that people do want to stick with. And again, the transformative word is think about it as a result. Move it to the end of the equation. Spend your time focusing on how do I bring my identity to life through the promises I make so people get the experience they expect. Rinse and repeat over and over and over again. Thanks so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I didn't give people much time to ask any as I went through, so...
Michelle, thank you. That was a great run through. We're really happy to take questions now, and we do have some coming through. So please type them into the chat box. And as Michelle also said, you will be getting more material on this. There's a lot to take in. It's a big subject, but it's such a massively important one. Okay, so the first question. You said it's not good to over-deliver on your promises. That goes against what I've been taught in the past. Can you please explain?
Is probably the number one question that I get asked, especially in today's climate of experience is the mother's milk of everything, right? So you can't pretty much turn around without running into something about customer experience or experience in general. So there is a meme out there. It's a myth. It is a myth, right? That well, for people to be happy, I've got to do more. I've got to over deliver. And it's actually better to sort of set a low expectation and exceed it than it is to actually, just do what I say I'm going to do. Here's the problem with that. You can only exceed expectations for so long. Eventually, you're going to run out of runway. And then what? So then your people who've become trained to expect you to do more, because every time you exceed an expectation, that becomes the new expectation. And you're training people to expect you to do more. So when you can't, what's going to happen? Well, they're going to be disappointed for no other reason than that you just simply do what you say you're going to do. The point in fact is that this is where the delight thing's quite toxic, and I really dislike it a lot. Delight can only ever be a response. If you think about delight as in the way it's defined, really. So delight is essentially, you've exceeded my expectation. But here's the thing, you didn't know what my expectation was. You didn't ask me what it was. And even if you had, I probably wouldn't have been able to tell you, because we're really bad at being able to say what we expect. And if I could say it, it would probably be different tomorrow. And so there's really no way you can delight me. What you can do, and this has happened to me, and I've written about this a couple of times, is you can be prepared, right? You can have a mindset that when that rare opportunity presents itself for delight, that you can actually, without changing an expectation, go a little bit above and beyond, because the situation calls for it. It's not something you're promising to do all the time, but it is that momentary thing. Then go for it. That's fine. I'm not saying never delight customers. I'm just saying don't make it a promise that you will. Because the minute you make a promise that you will, you pretty much set yourself up that you're not going to be able to. Because if it's my expectation you're going to delight me, you're not going to be able to, because that requires you to exceed my expectation, which you don't know what it is anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, and now someone's just added into the chat that we do have some questions, and we'll be going through those. But someone's just added into the chat here. The talk of the guest speaker today is more or less about keeping your promises, which should be a no-brainer anyway.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I would argue, though, that go through a day and count the number of promises that get broken. It's a lot. We're really bad at this. It's weird to think that, yes, it's a no-brainer and it sounds the most obvious thing in the world, but we are incredibly bad at making promises in a very deliberate, consistent way. Our general tone seems to be, what I call, it's a promise and apologize sort of thing, is we'll make a promise, and if we don't keep it, that's okay, we'll just apologize.
Make the promise to get the business and then apologize later.
Yeah, apologize when we can't do it. So I'd push back and say, yes, it's obvious. Yes, we should all do it. And lots of people don't. And all you've got to do is look at the cratering satisfaction scores across any business, any area, any sector, to know how that plays out on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Okay, Gareth, did you have a question?
I do. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks very much for taking the time to spend with us today.
My pleasure.
My question, many of our clients are e-commerce only businesses where all of the experience is somewhat faceless, i.e. limited human interaction with customers.
Yep.
So what are some tips that these e-commerce businesses could apply to their websites / digital experiences that could, there's the question.
Yeah. Okay, so just because something's online, just because something's not literal between two people physically, doesn't mean that promises aren't being made, doesn't mean that you're not setting expectations. And in fact, I would say in a digital environment, it's even more important to be very clear and explicit and set expectations. So do the work behind the scenes to understand what you can and can't do on it consistently, what you will and won't do consistently, then find a way to make that clear through your website. An example of this might be shipping times, right? This is a great one for e-commerce businesses because it always includes sending people something in the mail, and depending on where you are and what service you use for your shipping and all the rest of it, some of those times can be quite elastic. It's still really important to give people a sense of what that is. A story I tell a lot, Zappos is world famous, right, for making people, they say, make people happy, and they, quote unquote, work on delighting people at every turn. But a friend of mine ordered some shoes from them, chose 3-day shipping because she was going to be out of town. She wasn't going to be home to get the package. Zappos knew better. No, we know what she wants. And so they sent it overnight. She wasn't home to get it. The package sat on her doorstep for 2 days in the snow. So not so delightful, right? So there's an arrogance to thinking that So I would say for the other thing for commerce people, it's really important to do the work of thinking like the people that are coming to your site. And that's not about them. That's a different thing. So when I think about you, I'm like, well, I think you're going to like this and this and this and this. Thinking like you means literally being you. How would I feel if this happened to me? Not how do I think the customer's going to feel if we do this to them? How would I feel if this happened to me? How would I feel if this was what was told to me, this promise was made to me? And that's a really great way to actually start to bring more humanity into that digital interaction.
Yeah, I think it was a long time ago in the origins of advertising that David Ogilvy said something like, always write ad copy as if you're writing to your mother.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and somebody else, there's a question here, how do you get clients to remember the good experiences? Since it seems some clients tend to remember you as good as the last thing that you did, right? The last game. And this is a great question because the brain science around this stuff is fascinating, and I always encourage people to dig into it, is that we are hardwired to disproportionately remember and value the negative. Right? So we will always, when people say to me about complaints and compliments, I always say, what's the ratio? Because you're going to always get more complaints than compliments, always. It's just how we're hardwired. You think about yourself, something bad happens, you dine out on it for a week, right? You tell everybody you meet, every coffee is like, oh my God, you can't believe what happened to me last week. Whereas the good stuff we barely mention. We file it away and like, oh, that was nice. But we hardly ever tell anyone. And that dynamic hasn't changed dramatically via social media, by the way. And so how do you get clients to remember, because they tend to remember the last thing? That's also brain science. So there's this thing called peak end rule, where again, the last thing we experience is the thing we remember. So I always say to people, if you're thinking about the experience and you're thinking about the promises that you're making, really, really make sure that the ones that impact the last point of contact, the last piece of the experience the customer or anybody has with you is the most positive. Because the rest they'll rationalize and forget for the most part. So it's irrelevant having a terrific onboarding experience for your employees if when you fire them, you treat them like crap. Because they'll remember the latter, they won't remember the former. Right? And same with customers. It's no good spending all this wonderful time onboarding them if then, the checkout experience is terrible, or when they get their package in the mail, it's in a crumpled up bag with, that's been all broken on the corners.
So it's the most recent experience they remember the most. That's what.
Yeah. Well, along with the point of highest emotion.
Yeah.
Right? So that's why it's called peak end. But yeah, the end is disproportionately important. Okay.
So now there's another question. How do you? Sorry, wait a minute. It was this one here. How do you get internal buy-in into a brand strategy without sounding fluffy? Do we approach by reviewing our endpoints with customers and staff? How do you get internal buy-in into a brand strategy?
Well, okay, so again, I care about what I connect with. I care about what I feel is quote unquote meaningful and relevant. What organizations universally, in my experience that I've worked with, fail to do is they have their high level statements around who this is what we care about, and this is what we stand for, and this is what we're about, and they don't help people in the organization connect that to their day-to-day work. They don't show them what the path is between that and what they do. And this is everyone in the organization, whether you're in IT, finance, in the warehouse, like out in the field on sales, whatever it is. I need to be able to say, this thing that I'm doing right now, because I do this happens, that happens, then that happens, and that means we do this thing that we care about.
So part of it is to show everybody within the organisation that their role in delivering the promise is actually really important.
Well, it's not even just their role, right? It's literally, tangibly, tactically what they like. How does what I'm doing, the physical activity that I'm doing, contribute to that? Because it can be really hard to understand. The best example of this, and again, I don't use the promise. How does it contribute to our identity is probably a better way, because promise, I use promise universally, not as a meta thing that we point to. So how do we deliver our purpose? How do we achieve our purpose? How do we meet our purpose is probably, and how do we demonstrate our values? And how, because that's essentially sits at the heart of what the brand is, of what the brand result is. So how do I make sure that people, no matter what they do in the organization, understand how it does that? So FedEx is a great example. People talk about it as the NASA story. I use FedEx because that's how I heard it. So guy sweeping up the dock in FedEx, guy doing a consulting job comes along and says, so tell me what you're doing. And they says, well, I'm helping parcels get out, to our customers overnight. And the guy says, what do you mean? You're sweeping the dock? And the janitor says, well, yeah, but if I don't sweep the dock and keep it clear of all the rubbish and packaging, the trucks can't come in. If the trucks can't come in, we can't unload and load. If we can't unload and load, the packages don't go out. If the packages don't go out, the customers don't get them. So he was able to connect his job of sweeping the dock to actually to keeping FedEx's promise, which was absolutely positively overnight.
Yeah.
Now, and what I say to people, and the question I ask is, how many people in your organization could do that? Can make that connection? And when they can do that, you don't need to worry about brand strategy. It will take care of itself.
Okay. Now, if anyone's got any other questions, we do have one more, but if you've got any others, we're going to be wrapping up soon, so now's a good time to ask it. One question, this one here, are you saying that all the marketing I do doesn't really matter? How does it fit in with marketing?
So marketing is just one function of the business that makes promises, right? It's only one function. The problem when you talk about brand is because brand quite often sits as a marketing thing. That's back to that visual, how people pick you out of a lineup stuff I talked about, right? And I'm largely talking about marketing communications here, because marketing broadly is a different discipline that helps drive product development and all sorts of things. So yeah, marketing still has a role to play. And it's actually a really important role, because it is often the connective tissue between the organization and the external. So if marketing isn't being really deeply connected to the promises the organization is making and what promises they can keep, there's a really big chance that they set the organization up for failure by overpromising. And nearly all the failures of promise that I see that people respond to that result in unhappy customers are failures of marketing to actually understand the nature of promise and the role that it plays. The broader business, though, is no less important. If your warehouse isn't well set up to understand the promises that are being made, and if you're not paying attention to how those are being kept, right? then products don't appear on shelves or in inventory, and somebody goes and buys something and it's not there, and then they're, so this stuff's a web. It's an ecosystem of which marketing is a part, but it's not the only part, and it's not even the most important part. They're all equally important.
Good stuff, Michelle. Thank you. That's been really inspiring. I found it that way, and enlightening and challenging as well. So thank you very much. But I would also add totally relevant. And anyone who thinks that they're keeping all their promises at the moment, fantastic. You've got an unusual business. We do have 2 more webinars planned for this year, and so I've just quickly introduced those for the people who are here. Smart e-commerce strategies is coming up on the 26th, and ransomware, traps to avoid and tips and tools. That's as you can see there, the 5th of December. We'll let you know about those ones. And really, if you do want to take anything further, if you want any more help with any of this stuff, then you can get in touch with Michelle about brand. You can also get in touch with us at Concise, and we can introduce you to Michelle, or we can assist you with what it takes to understand and apply some of the stuff that Michelle was talking about. Michelle, have you got any final comments to wrap up?
Oh, just thanks so much for the chance to come and talk to people about this. It's so important, and I'll be delighted to share, as I said, get out a copy of my book, The Unheroic Work, to everybody. And there's lots of stuff in there that builds on this that they can actually use sort of day to day in their businesses, because that's the big thing, is that you own your brand result. It's nothing that you can outsource. So every organization has to own and take responsibility for it. And I'm all about helping sort of give you guys what you need to do that.
Thanks very much. Gareth, got comments?
Nope, just thank you very much.
Okay, excellent. Again, thanks everybody for attending, and thank you, Michelle, for your time and your brilliant thoughts. Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
All the best, everyone.